If you ever find a lost child alone in the desert, remember this: the desert always has a story behind it. The old rancher William Carter liked to say those words whenever someone asked him why he never ignored strange things on the land around his ranch. 15 years earlier, on a day when the Arizona sky had turned the color of rust and the wind howled across the open range at nearly 40 miles an hour, those words had not yet formed in his mind. That afternoon had started like any other. William was riding along the far edge of his property, checking broken fence posts after a long dry spell. His horse moved slowly through the dust while the wind carried sand across the empty plain. The storm had rolled in fast, the kind of desert sandstorm that could swallow the horizon and make a grown man lose his direction within minutes. William pulled his hat lower against the wind and turned his horse toward home, knowing the storm would only grow worse. Then he saw something that should not have been there. At first he thought it was just a bundle of cloth caught between two desert shrubs about 100 yards away. But the shape moved. William stopped his horse and squinted through the swirling dust. The bundle shifted again, small and unsteady. He guided the horse closer, slowly, careful not to startle whatever it was. When he finally reached the shrubs, the truth hit him like a sudden silence in the storm. A small girl stood there, no more than 8 years old, her dark hair tangled with dust and her buckskin clothing worn thin from travel. Her eyes were wide but steady, watching him without fear and without trust. She looked Apache, though William had never seen a child so far from the canyon lands alone. The wind pushed against them while the sky above turned darker with blowing sand. The girl did not speak. She simply stood there as if the desert itself had placed her on that lonely patch of ground. William climbed down from his horse and knelt a few feet away so he would not seem threatening. He spoke slowly and calmly, the same way he spoke to nervous horses. The girl did not answer. She did not move either. She only watched him with those sharp, quiet eyes that seemed older than a child's. William looked around the empty plain. There were no riders, no wagons, no smoke from distant camps. Nothing but wind and dust stretching for miles in every direction. Whatever path had brought this girl here had disappeared in the storm. William realized something simple and heavy at the same time. If he left her there, the desert would claim her before nightfall. He stood up slowly, removed his coat, and held it out toward her. For a long moment she did nothing. Then the girl stepped forward and accepted it. William lifted her carefully onto the saddle in front of him, turning his horse toward the ranch house nearly 2 miles away. The storm swallowed the land behind them as they rode. Neither of them spoke on the long ride back. And William Carter had no idea that the quiet girl sitting in front of him would one day return to his ranch as the leader of an entire Apache tribe. The ride back to the ranch took longer than usual because the storm had grown thicker across the open land, and the wind pushed hard against William Carter and his horse as they moved slowly through the swirling sand. The little Apache girl sat quietly in front of him, wrapped in his heavy coat, her small hands gripping the saddle horn without saying a single word. William could feel how light she was, far too light for a child who should have been running and laughing somewhere safe. Every few minutes he glanced down to make sure she was still awake, but each time he looked he saw the same steady eyes staring forward through the dust, as if she already understood the desert better than many grown men. When the roof of the ranch house finally appeared through the storm about 2 miles ahead, William felt a quiet sense of relief settle in his chest. The ranch stood alone on a stretch of dry land with a barn, a small corral, and a windmill that creaked slowly whenever the wind grew strong. As he rode into the yard, the horse snorted and lowered its head, happy to be home. William climbed down and carefully lifted the girl from the saddle. She landed lightly on the ground and immediately stepped back, watching everything around her with cautious curiosity. The storm roared across the plains, rattling the wooden boards of the barn and sending loose straw tumbling across the yard. William opened the door of the ranch house and gestured for her to come inside. For a moment she did not move, studying the doorway as if she had never seen a place like it before. Then she walked in slowly, her small boots leaving dusty marks on the wooden floor. The ranch house smelled of coffee, leather, and dry wood, the familiar scent of a place that had been lived in for many years. William removed another coat from a chair and placed it near the stove while the iron kettle warmed on the fire. He poured a cup of water and offered it to the girl. She accepted it carefully and drank without taking her eyes off him. Even after finishing the water, she still did not speak. William tried a few simple questions, asking where she came from and if her family was nearby, but the girl only watched him silently. There was no fear in her face, only a quiet strength that surprised him. It was the kind of steady look he had seen before in older Apache riders who sometimes passed along the distant hills. After a while, William placed a bowl of warm food on the table. The girl hesitated at first, then sat down and began to eat slowly, as if measuring every movement. Outside, the storm continued to sweep across the empty plains, erasing any tracks that might have explained how she arrived there. As the evening light faded through the window, William realized something strange. The girl had not spoken a single word since he found her, yet somehow the room did not feel silent. Her presence carried a quiet determination that filled the small ranch house like a story waiting to unfold. And William Carter could not shake the feeling that the child sitting across from him had walked out of the desert for a reason that neither of them yet understood. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the desert strangely quiet as the early sunlight stretched across the open land around William Carter's ranch. The windmill creaked slowly above the well, and the long shadows of the barn reached across the yard while the ranch woke to another dry Arizona day. Inside the ranch house, the little Apache girl was already awake. William noticed it the moment he stepped into the kitchen. She sat near the window, watching the land outside as if she had been there for hours. A small blanket rested around her shoulders, and the morning light revealed the fine dust still tangled in her dark hair. William poured water into a kettle and placed it on the stove, glancing toward her from time to time. The girl did not speak, just as she had not spoken the day before. But something about the way she watched the ranch made it clear that she was paying attention to everything. After breakfast, William stepped outside to begin his morning work. The fences still needed repair after the storm, and the horses in the corral had grown restless from the night winds. As he lifted a wooden rail back into place, he noticed the girl standing quietly near the porch. She had followed him outside without making a sound. For a moment, she simply watched him work. Then she walked slowly across the yard, studying the horses, the barn, and the long stretch of land beyond the fence line. William kept working but spoke to her calmly from time to time, explaining what he was doing even though he did not know whether she understood his words. When he carried a bucket toward the trough, the girl stepped forward and helped steady it without being asked. Her movements were careful and deliberate, as if she had already learned the rhythm of ranch work somewhere else. William found that surprising. She was young, but there was nothing uncertain in the way she moved. Throughout the morning, she followed him quietly around the ranch, watching every task from feeding the horses to checking the windmill. By midday, the desert sun had warmed the yard, and the storm felt like a distant memory. William rested his hands on the fence and looked out toward the wide, empty horizon. Normally, he could see miles of open land without a single rider crossing it. But that day, he noticed something unusual along the far ridge of the canyon hills nearly a mile away. At first, he thought it might be shifting shadows from the morning sun. Then the shapes moved slightly against the sky. William narrowed his eyes and studied the distant ridge. The figures were too far away to see clearly, but he could tell they were riders. They stood motionless along the high ground, watching the ranch from a distance. William did not say anything yet. Instead, he glanced down at the girl beside him. She had stopped moving as well. Her eyes were fixed on the same distant ridge. And in that quiet moment, William Carter realized that whoever those riders were, They were not strangers to the silent child who had walked out of the desert the day before. William Carter kept his eyes on the distant ridge for several long seconds, watching the shapes against the sky without moving. The riders remained still on the high ground nearly a mile away, dark silhouettes against the bright desert horizon. Beside him, the little Apache girl did not say a word, yet something about her posture had changed. She stood very still now, her small shoulders straight, her eyes fixed on the same ridge, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. The morning sun continued rising over the Arizona plains, lighting the open land with a pale gold glow. From the ranch yard, the ridge looked quiet and far away, but William knew that riders did not appear on that hill by accident. Anyone who traveled that route understood that the ranch below belonged to him. He leaned one arm against the fence and studied the figures again. There were several of them, perhaps 5 or 6 horses spread across the ridgeline. They were not moving toward the ranch. They were only watching. William had lived on that land long enough to recognize when someone was observing instead of passing through. After a moment, he looked down at the girl. She had not taken her eyes off the distant riders. The wind brushed lightly across the yard, carrying the dry scent of desert grass. William spoke gently, the same calm voice he used when speaking to nervous horses or lost travelers. He asked if she knew the riders on the hill. The girl did not answer, but her expression shifted slightly, almost like recognition passing across her face. That was enough for William to understand something important. Those riders had not come for him. They had come for her. The realization settled slowly in his mind. Somewhere out there in the wide canyon country, a group of Apache riders had been searching, and now they had finally found what they were looking for. William straightened and rested his hands on the fence rail. The riders still had not moved. They waited on the ridge with the patience of people who understood the land and the distance between them and the ranch. Minutes passed quietly. The horses in the corral shifted their weight, and the windmill creaked overhead. Finally, the riders began to turn their horses. One by one, they moved away from the ridge and disappeared behind the rise of the canyon hills. William watched until the last shape vanished from sight. Only then did he glance back at the girl. She was still staring at the place where the riders had stood. The silence between them felt heavier now, filled with questions neither of them had spoken aloud. William did not try to press her for answers. Instead, he returned to his work around the ranch as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Yet throughout the rest of the day, he could not shake the feeling that the quiet visit on the ridge had been only the beginning of something larger. Somewhere beyond the canyon hills, people now knew exactly where the lost Apache girl had been found, and sooner or later they would return. The afternoon passed slowly across the ranch, but William Carter could not shake the memory of the riders who had appeared on the ridge that morning. The desert had returned to its usual quiet rhythm, yet the silence felt different now, as if the land itself were waiting for something to happen. The little Apache girl moved through the ranch yard with the same quiet awareness she had shown since the moment he found her in the storm. She still had not spoken a single word, but she watched everything. When William carried tools to repair the fence line, she walked a few steps behind him. When he filled the water trough for the horses, she studied how the bucket was lifted and balanced. She seemed to absorb every small detail of ranch life as if she had always belonged there. By late afternoon, the sun hung low above the western hills, painting the desert in deep orange light. William leaned against the corral fence while the horses shifted lazily in the warm air. The girl stood nearby with her eyes turned toward the distant canyon hills again. William followed her gaze. The ridge looked empty now, but the feeling of being observed had not completely faded. He wondered who the riders were and how long they had been searching the land for the missing child. The answer came sooner than he expected. Just before sunset, a single rider appeared on the same distant trail that crossed the open plain toward the ranch. The figure moved slowly and deliberately, guiding the horse down from the canyon hills and across the desert floor. William watched carefully as the rider drew closer. The man wore traditional Apache clothing and rode with the steady posture of someone who knew the land well. There was no hurry in his approach, only calm purpose. When the rider finally reached the edge of the ranch yard, he stopped his horse several yards away from the fence. The girl had already stepped forward by then. For the first time since William had found her in the storm, a faint change crossed her face. It was not fear. It was recognition. The Apache rider slowly dismounted and stood beside his horse. His dark eyes studied William for a long moment before shifting toward the child. The quiet desert wind moved across the yard, rustling the dry grass and turning the blades of the windmill above the well. William removed his hat as a sign of respect, understanding that this man had likely come a long way. The Apache rider spoke calmly in his own language, his voice low and steady. The girl listened closely, her expression serious as she answered him with a few quiet words. It was the first time William had heard her voice since the day he found her. He could not understand the language, but he understood the meaning behind the moment. The rider had come for her. After a brief conversation, the Apache man turned his attention back to William. His voice was slow but clear when he spoke in careful English. He thanked the rancher for protecting the child and explained that the tribe had been searching the canyon lands for days. William nodded quietly, realizing that the mysterious riders on the ridge had been scouts making sure the girl was safe before approaching. The Apache man stepped toward the girl and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. The moment had the quiet weight of something important coming to an end. William Carter suddenly understood that the desert had not simply delivered a lost child to his ranch. It had placed a small part of a much larger story in his hands, even if only for a short time. The Apache rider remained beside his horse while the desert evening settled quietly over the ranch yard, and for several moments no one moved. William Carter stood with his hat in his hands, watching the small girl who had appeared out of the storm only a day earlier. Now she stood beside the rider as if she had always belonged there. The child spoke again in her language, her voice soft but steady, and the Apache man listened carefully. Even without understanding the words, William could see that the conversation carried the weight of something important. The rider finally nodded once and placed his hand gently over his chest before turning back toward William. His English was careful but clear when he spoke again. He said the child belonged to a respected family among their people, and that many riders had been searching the desert since she became separated from them during travel through the canyon lands. William listened quietly, his eyes moving once toward the girl. She stood calmly beside the rider, watching both men as if she understood every part of the moment unfolding around her. The Apache man then explained something that made William pause. He said the child was not only part of the tribe, but part of a family line that carried responsibility among their people. The rider did not speak loudly or with pride. Instead, he spoke with the quiet tone of someone describing a duty that had existed long before either of them were born. William nodded slowly, realizing the child had likely been raised with lessons and expectations that a simple ranch life could never replace. The desert wind brushed across the yard as the sun slipped lower behind the distant hills. The girl stepped forward then and looked directly at William for several seconds. Her steady eyes carried the same calm strength he had noticed from the moment he found her standing alone between the desert shrubs. Without saying anything, she reached up and handed him the coat he had placed around her shoulders during the storm. William accepted it slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rancher understood that this quiet exchange was her way of saying goodbye. The Apache rider helped the girl climb onto the horse, placing her carefully in front of the saddle just as William had done the day before. When the rider mounted behind her, he gave William a final nod of respect. The horses turned toward the canyon trail as the sky deepened into the colors of sunset. William remained near the fence while the two figures rode slowly away across the open land. The girl looked back once from the saddle, her dark hair moving in the wind. Then the rider guided the horse toward the canyon path where the rest of their people waited somewhere beyond the hills. The desert grew quiet again after they disappeared into the fading light. William Carter stood alone in the ranch yard as the windmill creaked softly above the well. He folded the coat over his arm and looked toward the distant ridge where the riders had first appeared that morning. At the time, he believed the story had ended there. But the desert has a way of carrying unfinished stories across many years, and William had no idea that 15 years later the same horizon would bring the girl back to his ranch again, though this time she would not return as a lost child. The years moved quietly across the desert after that evening, and life on the Carter Ranch continued in the steady rhythm that William Carter had always known. Seasons came and went across the wide Arizona land, each one bringing its own familiar work. In the spring, the pastures turned green for a short time before the summer heat returned. In autumn, the air cooled just enough to carry the scent of dust and dry grass across the hills. William repaired fences, guided cattle across grazing land, and watched the long horizon every morning while the sun rose above the distant canyon walls. Many travelers passed through the region over the years, but none of them carried the memory that stayed with him from the storm 15 years earlier. Sometimes when the wind moved through the cottonwood trees near the creek, William would remember the small Apache girl standing silently beside his horse on that desert night. He never knew what became of her, yet the memory stayed clear in his mind as if the moment had happened only yesterday. The ranch slowly grew as the years passed. New barns were built, more cattle filled the fields, and the small house on the hill was repaired many times against the desert weather. William grew older as well, though his steady habits never changed. Every morning he still rode across the same trails, checking water wells and pasture fences across the wide property. One late afternoon in early autumn, the sky carried the deep golden color that appears just before sunset in the desert. William had just finished securing a gate near the lower pasture when he noticed movement along the distant ridge road. At first, he believed it was another group of traders traveling between settlements. Riders appeared from time to time along that trail because it connected several distant towns across the canyon country. But as the riders moved closer, William realized their formation was different. They rode in a quiet, organized line that suggested purpose rather than travel. The group approached slowly across the open land until their horses reached the long dirt road leading toward the Carter Ranch house. William leaned slightly forward in the saddle while watching them approach. There were 6 riders in total, all wearing clothing that marked them as Apache. Their horses moved calmly, guided with steady confidence across the dry field. But it was the rider in the center of the group who immediately drew William's attention. She rode slightly ahead of the others, sitting tall in the saddle with calm authority. Her clothing carried the traditional patterns of her people, yet her presence held something more powerful than appearance alone. The group stopped a short distance from the ranch gate. For several seconds, no one spoke while the evening wind moved softly across the grass. The leading rider studied William carefully, her dark eyes focused with quiet recognition. Then she guided her horse forward a few steps. William felt a strange sense of familiarity even before she spoke. When her voice finally broke the silence, it carried the calm strength of someone who had spent many years learning how to lead others. She said that long ago, during a desert storm, a rancher had found a lost Apache girl standing alone among the desert shrubs. She said that rancher gave the child shelter, warmth, and protection until her people found her again. William felt his breath pause as the memory returned clearly in his mind. The rider looked directly at him as the final light of sunset spread across the open land. Then she spoke again, this time with a small but unmistakable smile. She told him that the lost child had returned to thank him, though now she carried a responsibility that reached far beyond that storm long ago. William Carter remained on his horse for several quiet seconds after hearing the rider speak those words, because the realization slowly settled across his mind like the desert sunset spreading across the hills. The young woman sitting calmly on the horse before him was no longer the small child he had once wrapped in a coat during a cold storm. 15 years had transformed that silent girl into someone whose presence carried calm authority and quiet strength. The riders behind her waited respectfully, allowing the moment between the two of them to unfold without interruption. William finally stepped down from his saddle and walked a few steps closer to the gate. The evening light reflected softly across the dust of the ranch road, while the wind moved gently through the dry grass nearby. The woman guided her horse forward until she stood only a few yards from him. Up close, the familiarity in her eyes became unmistakable. Though time had changed her appearance, the steady calm in her gaze was the same one he remembered from the frightened child who had stood alone in the desert long ago. She spoke again with clear and respectful English, explaining that after returning to her people that night, she grew up learning the responsibilities expected within her tribe. Her family belonged to a respected line among their community, and over the years she had been trained in leadership, traditions, and the duties required to guide her people through changing times. William listened carefully as she described the long path that eventually led her to become the chosen chief of her tribe. Her voice carried no pride or boastfulness, only the steady honesty of someone describing a responsibility that had been placed upon her shoulders. She then explained that many years earlier, her elders had told her never to forget the rancher who protected her when she was lost and alone. The tribe believed that acts of kindness carried meaning beyond a single moment, and they believed gratitude must always be returned. The riders behind her nodded quietly as she spoke, confirming the importance of the tradition she described. William removed his hat and held it respectfully in his hands. He admitted that he never expected to see the girl again, and that he had always wondered what path her life might take after that storm. The woman smiled gently and looked across the familiar fields of the ranch. She said that during the many years of her training, she often remembered the quiet ranch house, the warm fire, and the kindness of a stranger who asked for nothing in return. Then she explained the reason she had come back. Her people had begun building stronger relationships with the surrounding ranchers and towns across the region, and she wanted the first visit of friendship to be made here. William slowly nodded as he understood the meaning behind her words. The evening sun dropped lower behind the distant canyon walls while the long shadows stretched across the pasture. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the woman reached into a small leather pouch attached to her saddle and carefully removed a simple carved stone pendant. She held it out toward William and explained that among her people the stone symbolized protection and remembrance. It was given only to someone whose actions had once protected a member of the tribe. William accepted the pendant with quiet respect, realizing that the small act he had almost forgotten had carried meaning far beyond that single night in the desert. William Carter held the small carved stone pendant in his hands while the last light of evening settled across the ranch. The smooth surface of the stone felt cool against his palm, and for a moment, he simply studied the simple markings carved carefully into its surface. The Apache woman watched him quietly from her horse, her expression calm but thoughtful. Around them, the desert air carried the peaceful stillness that often arrives just before nightfall across the Arizona plains. William slowly looked up again toward the rider. Even though 15 years had passed, the connection between the moment he remembered and the woman standing before him now felt clear and undeniable. The lost child from the storm had returned not only with gratitude, but with the strength of someone who had grown into responsibility and leadership. William placed the pendant carefully into his pocket and nodded respectfully. He told her that the small kindness he offered years ago had never been meant to create a debt. He had simply done what anyone should do when they find a child alone in the desert during a storm. The Apache chief listened carefully before answering. She explained that within her people's traditions, kindness was never measured by its size, but by the heart behind the action. The elders believed that moments of compassion could travel far beyond the original act and shape the future in ways people rarely expect. That belief, she said, was one of the reasons she had chosen to visit his ranch first when beginning her efforts to strengthen peace and cooperation between her tribe and the neighboring ranchers of the region. William glanced toward the open fields stretching beyond the fence. For many years he had lived quietly with his cattle and horses, rarely considering that his small ranch might one day become a place where two different worlds met with respect. The Apache riders behind their chief remained still, their horses standing calmly as the sky deepened into the first shades of twilight. After a few moments, the chief gently guided her horse forward through the ranch gate. She explained that her people wished to begin a new chapter with the ranchers who shared the land surrounding the canyon country. They believed cooperation would help both communities face the future with greater strength. William welcomed the riders onto his land and offered them water for their horses and a place to rest before night fully arrived. As they moved slowly toward the ranch house, the windmill beside the well turned softly in the evening breeze, just as it had on the night the lost girl first arrived years earlier. The chief looked toward the old windmill and smiled slightly, recognizing the same familiar place that had once offered her safety when she was small and frightened. The desert night slowly settled over the ranch while lantern light began to glow from the windows of the house. In that quiet moment, William realized something simple but powerful. A single act of kindness on a stormy night had quietly connected two lives across 15 long years of desert time. And now, as the stars began to appear above the wide Arizona sky,